Hello, and welcome back to Hill and Ponton's YouTube channel. I'm attorney Allison Reddick, and I'm joined again by our special guest, Dr. Al Vonetes, a contract compensation and pension examiner. How are you doing today, Dr. Vonetes?
I'm doing well, Allison. Thanks for having me again. As usual, it's always a pleasure doing these videos with you folks.
Absolutely, and I just think it's so important and special for us to be able to have the perspective of a C&P examiner, especially with the sensitive topic we're going to be talking about today. So I want to start off with a trigger warning that this is a very difficult topic to talk about. We're going to be getting into realistic examples of military sexual trauma, also known as MST, the aftermath. This is something very difficult, but is often cast aside and isn't talked about. And it's something that occurs very frequently in the military. And I think it's very important for us to elaborate on this topic. So I guess I'll start with what qualifies as an MST in the eyes of the VA, and then you can kind of tell me what you think qualifies as an MST in the eyes of a psychologist. So a military sexual trauma refers to sexual assault or sexual harassment experienced during military service. It could be feeling pressured or coerced into sexual activities with threats of negative treatment, or even in some cases, positive treatment. You could be getting promotions and things like that. It can be physical touch, or it can be verbal comments about your body or sexual activity. So that's how the VA perceives it. Is that how you perceive it as well?
That is, I found that to be a very accurate description of it.
So we are seeing military sexual trauma cases more frequently, and we get them fairly often. Are you seeing veterans for examinations with regard to military sexual trauma?
Yes, absolutely. Quite frequently. Maybe 10% of claims are MST type claims. So it's extremely prevalent.
And I see in a lot of cases where the veteran will come forward with a mental health claim, and then within the C&P examination, they could reveal that they suffered a military sexual trauma as well. Have you had that experience?
That's true. Yeah, that does happen. I've had many type of PTSD claims, whether they were MST or even combat, come in as something else like anxiety disorder unspecified. But then once we get into it, the true reason will reveal itself. And yeah, a lot of times that is MST.
The numbers are showing that women are the ones who are being victims of military sexual trauma, but men are victims of this as well. What kind of ratio are you seeing of women versus men? Because obviously there's way more men in service and they're less likely to discuss such incidences, but it happens.
It does, and that happens pretty frequently. It's difficult to tease out the actual percentage. I mean, it's pretty close, though, in terms of whether it's male or female. But I will say, if it is a female claimant, like if I see that it is going to be a female claimant for the day, I will look to see if it's going to be MST, because it is a little different of how you approach it as towards other types of claims.
Absolutely, because I experience with the servicewomen that I interact with that just being a woman in the service, you're going to be treated differently. I would say 100% of them that I've talked to have experienced some sort of harassment, but depending on how their psyche takes it, some of them were like, well, they consider you one of the guys, they're going to tease you and mess with you. I see some like that, but then some where it's to a point where it affects their mental health. Are you kind of seeing that range as well?
Absolutely. And I describe it as very similar to the culture of a prison or a fraternity house. I've been in both of those, and the culture can be very alpha male, and a lot of times boundaries are pushed beyond things that would happen in the civilian world where there's an HR department or things of that nature to prevent the likelihood of that happening. But yes, definitely seeing that.
So with military sexual trauma cases, the VA gets it wrong a lot. There was a 2017 report from the VA Inspector General's office that showed within just 6 months, VA officials improperly refused PTSD service-connected benefits to military sexual trauma for more than 1,300 veterans, and the majority were women. Do you have any idea of why this is? I mean, is it not believing? Is it a lack of evidence? Or is it just not assessing the claims in the proper way?
I would say the second one, the lack of evidence. It is difficult. These are the toughest cases. When I get these, I know that I'm in for a game of ping pong with the VA where they're going to come back to me several times and want to know marker evidence. So if it's a combat veteran and, okay, let's just say we can't really identify how he's feeling, okay, but we can at least say, the guy's got a combat action ribbon, a combat infantry badge, a Purple Heart. So what I find with cases where it's difficult or they get denied or they're just struggling to connect it to service, it is a lack of evidence. And the evidence they're looking for is specifically marker evidence. And this could be from a buddy statement, breakup of primary relationship, like a significant other, or multiple relationships. Many times, like, especially with older MST folks, they never got married, or they were married, they don't have any kids at all, or, something like that. It could be behavioral problems in the service, Article 15, captain's mask kind of thing, where now you're kind of bucking authority because, a lot of times it could have been leadership that was either involved or played a role in it, or is just trying to sweep it under the rug. Substance abuse is another one, especially if there's documented treatment. Anything you can get documented, service treatment records showing that you went for mental health treatment, or if not mental health, maybe to an STD clinic or a pregnancy test. Anything you can get to show that life changed dramatically during this specific time period.
So you mentioned the combat veterans. I think that was a good example because there's actually a regulation where if you were in combat, most likely they're not taking records down of if you were injured or sprained your ankle. So there's a regulation where it's basically like if your injury occurred in what would be the common place, time, and specifics of combat, then it's a lower burden of proof. For MST, I would say it's not necessarily a lower burden of proof, but it's a looser burden for corroborating that the MST happened. So what that means is you have to give credible supporting evidence. So the examples that you gave, I'll kind of run through the markers that they look for: records from law enforcement authorities, rape crisis centers, mental health counseling centers, pregnancy tests, STD tests. But the thing is, a lot of these traumas are not reported. So the likelihood of seeing those types of evidence is low. I personally have never seen any of those for the evidence. Have you seen any law enforcement or rape crisis center or mental health things like that?
I never see arrest records or really even documented substance abuse unless there were somehow admission into a counseling. I mean, some of the things that the VA requires people to produce is just like impossible. The buddy statements is a realistic one to retrieve of people that saw you before, and now, they're like, Mary used to be the life of the party. Now she never wants to leave the house. Those kinds of things. I do find that it's almost laughable, the things that they would make you want produce to show evidence. It's not like it's different than other types of situations where there's a news story about it. I was on the Eisenhower when you can get details to this stuff to show that you were there, but with MST, I find it to be the absolute most difficult thing to connect to service.
Exactly. And I think it's important for people who have suffered MST to not give up on your claim just because, I didn't tell anyone or I don't have records of it, because there are other areas of evidence that show what they call markers that there was a change of behavior. So like you said, the buddy statements where prior to going on active active duty, they were happy, they were healthy, nothing happened to them, they weren't deployed, they didn't see combat. And then after, they're depressed and they don't want to talk to anyone and they don't want anyone to touch them. Like, I think
Yeah.
that's a great example. What about if like they tell someone 10 years later? So I'll have someone who will say, I suffered MST. I didn't tell anyone at the time. Now I have intimacy problems with my spouse. And, 10 years later, I told them about it. Is that a reliable form of evidence?
It is, because the truth is, when it happens, it takes a really hot minute just to realize, did that just even happen? And okay, now we're talking a long time just to process that this in fact occurred to me. And now, before we even going down the road of talking about it, that process has to take place, and that is not an easy thing to occur. And in reporting in the military, especially with this, is, I mean, again, in this type of setting and culture, there's a lot of victim blaming. So they're instantly going to look, I mean, not they on everybody, but depending on what type of branch of the service and what you were doing in the service, a lot of people will use the culture of blaming the victim for in fact the trauma, or taking sides with the higher ranking official, if that's the type of case it is. I do find that later reports are absolutely reliable. You can see the course of how much life damage was done with interpersonal relationships, friendships, work, intimacy, sleep. And so, yeah, I mean, I get folks in their 60s and 70s, reporting things that are more than viable.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of the issue is either it is someone of higher rank, and a lot of times it's not reported or it's covered up. And I've had cases where, it's a 30-year-old case, but that person who was the abuser now has some forced retirement because they were sexually harassing multiple members that were under them. And so even though, they harassed you 30 years ago, that's still evident. I mean, that is perfect evidence to say, look, this person that they're saying harassed them is now getting basically forced into a retirement, which,
True.
but I mean, that's a very specific case, whereas a lot of the times it is covered up.
Sometimes, Allison, it goes completely you might not even know. I mean, many times I've heard the story where, we had just finished basic. We were all out having a drink. Mm-hmm. And then one of the last things I remember, I was getting drunk. I wanted to leave. And, sometimes it could be a setup. It was either another female that lured them into it, or this person had been stalking that victim for a while. A lot of times the victims are very oblivious, not until it comes to their doorstep. Okay, after the event, yeah, then you're extremely hypervigilant and watching everybody. But before this stuff, most civilian people, even when they first go into the service, are going to be very trusting of their fellow man. You might turn your back on your drink because, you wouldn't think somebody would throw a roofie in it or something like that. But there's a lot of different ways that I have heard this go down, from people being cornered, on Navy ships. A lot of times, you get lost in there. It goes deep into the ship where or it could happen on leave. It could just happen. You could be, active duty and away from. So there's all types of different. I've heard of people just riding their bicycle outside the base and just random people that lived in the town. So there's a lot of different ways this could go. But I do find there's a few themes that do seem to come back.
What are the themes that you see most
prevalently? The higher ranking officer that makes threats, nobody's going to believe you. What are you going to say? Who are you going to tell? That kind of stuff. There's the use of alcohol and or drugs is another big one. And sometimes it could just be where you're just isolated. You're at wrong place, wrong time, and you went for a run, you went for a bike ride, you got your headphones on, and there's just predators out there. And they're just, wrong place, wrong time is a big one. I mean, you do have to have your head on a swivel out there, even in the nicest of neighborhoods. Those are probably the big ones, though.
So my question is there any research or statistical analysis of why this happens so frequently in the military? I have a lot of veterans who say, why me? Why did this happen to me? Are there markers for them being targeted, or is it just that it's these type of people that are in the military that are engaging in this behavior?
There's a few reasons for that. Okay, it's very similar to a prison type culture. It's survival of the fittest. Okay, in the service, it's not like in the civilian world where something happens, we call a first responder. In the military, you are the first responder, and you got to put out your own fires. And when you're overseas in some foreign country, it could be the foreigners or your own guys coming at you. I mean, it is so much of a survival. In other cultures, in the civilian world, it doesn't exist. There, like I say, there's HR departments. You could just quit and say, you know what, I'm not doing this. In the military, there could be great consequences. I mean, they could send you to Siberia. I mean, they could send you to Leavenworth. I mean, they can make your life a living hell that you cannot get out of, where that's just not the case with other jobs. And I would say that's why that happens, is because people are in great power and they have a lot of leverage to do all kinds of different things.
I especially tell the female service women or service members that ask me, or veterans, why me? Did I do something? And I go, you're a woman in the military that is majority men, testosterone filled. You didn't do anything, like that. That's just a situation where, you're most likely going to get harassed or targeted just because you're one of few women. If you're the only woman in your battalion and they haven't seen women in months, it's like prison.
Absolutely. Yeah. And trust me, when I was in a lot of those high security prisons, I am the cute blonde in there. Yeah. I mean, that's just the way it is. And
that's
out here we could, there's rules and laws and there's enforcement of laws. But in there and some of other places, no, you really got to watch your back, or, have your own six.
And I think that's important to note, is that a lot of the non-reporting is victim blaming, where, they try to say that, oh, well, you brought it on to yourself, or, oh, that's not really that big of a deal, things like that. So I just want, to make it known that if you experience something like this, like, you didn't do anything wrong, regardless of the situation. If someone did something to you against your will, regardless of if you told anyone or anything like that, we definitely want to try to help you with that and go through that process, because it is a difficult process. And so that's kind of what we're going to get into, is what your involvement in that process is. So kind of went off on a tangent, but back to the behavior change markers. Other ones that you can see potentially in records that we look for are, if you're requesting to transfer from one job to another, if you were working with someone who harassed you, or you were involved in a military sexual trauma, trying to get away from them and getting a transfer. Change in your work performance. If you were doing great, getting great marks, and then all of a sudden you're getting horrible performance reviews, that's a sign. The substance abuse. I've seen records where someone, no issues, and then all of a sudden they're in the ER for getting their stomach pumped, for drinking too much.
Yeah.
And they never had any issues. And it's because, something caused that to happen. And it happened multiple times because they were trying to use that to kind of numb what happened, because they felt like they couldn't do anything about it. Another one I see is, especially for women, quick marriages after finding someone and getting married and being protected, thinking, okay, if I get married, they're going to leave me alone and I'm protected. And yes, I met him 2 months ago, but I wanted to marry him, so I had someone to protect me.
Yeah, I've seen that. I've seen where some people become more sexually promiscuous because they want to go at it instead of having it come to them. And then other people just completely isolate. They don't want anything really to do with people. I had one lady tell me, I do a lot better with the four-leggeds than I do the two-leggeds. Just don't want to be around people, Yeah, I do see that for sure.
So I think another important thing to note is, when you're applying for benefits, MST isn't a diagnosis. It's the underlying trauma which caused some kind of mental diagnosis. I would say most frequently is PTSD, but could there be other diagnoses like depression or anxiety, things like that? Does it have to be PTSD?
No, it can be, frequent, intense panic attacks that meet criteria for panic disorder, or major depression is a big one because this stuff creates avoidance and things that are fun. I mean, usually sexual encounters are supposed to be a good thing. So when that becomes an adverse situation, that's not good because now you're missing a big piece of life. That is one of the better parts. So, depression is a big one. Extreme anxiety, especially the triggers are different. With combat trauma, you expect loud bangs and fireworks and smells of things like fuel or gunpowder. With this, triggers could be, it's more it could be things like being in an elevator with somebody or walking in a dark parking lot or the way somebody looks, especially if, I've had, ladies say like, I can't be around bald men or I can't be around, it's some sort of specific to this person. That also is similar with combat. I've had Vietnam veteran wives tell me, he won't even let me get my nails done by an Asian lady, because they're still so triggered by the veteran will be there, I don't know what they're saying, So, the triggers to this stuff are extremely different for each situation, but usually we can start identifying some of them. Near the end of a C&P, I like to give people a roadmap of where they should go in terms of treatment because, a lot of times they're getting fed medications and it's like, that might help take the edge off or help you get back to sleep, but it's not really processing this stuff.
So speaking of the C&P exam, that's where you come in. What is the process for you? Is VA asking you to try to see if the evidence in the file corroborates what they're saying happened, or is it just that you're giving a diagnosis? What's your process and how is it different for other mental health examinations?
We'll usually come in as a PTSD claim due to military sexual trauma, or they might say personal trauma, personal assault, or this is some sort of wording in that nature. So what we're trying to do here is the symptoms and the presentation of the claimant is usually very conducive to what would be diagnosis of PTSD to MST. Now the work becomes finding things in those records where we can show some sort of change from there to now. Separation exams is another one, entrance for a separation exam. We forgot to mention that one earlier. Sometimes it can be done. Sometimes it can be done fairly easy. Sometimes it is a lot of work.
So give me your process of going through a C&P examination for military sexual trauma, or like examples of what you've gone through and how you were able to corroborate it and say that they have a mental health condition due to a military sexual trauma.
So similar to other PTSD, you start with background, especially if this is an initial. An initial, we go through the whole thing. So most folks that were in the service, had pretty good childhoods. Every once in a while, I find people that had rough childhood, or there's also a prevalence of some folks that were raped in the service were raped before. I have seen where this has been like a theme for some folks. That's not too frequent, but it does happen. So we go through background, school, family, work, marital history, all the way through all those experiences from before the service, during the service, and then after the service. So you get a good picture of who this person was, where they were born, where they grew up, how we're friends, social situations, they might have played sports, was on the track team, had a boyfriend, that kind of stuff. Then if it's an initial, a lot of times times I will look to see the statement that they had written to set up the claim. And a lot of times I can copy and paste that in there. I mean, I do like to spare people the agony of going down the road. I can walk out to a waiting room and see people that look like they're getting ready to take a seat at the injection table because this is like the most painful thing. So, I mean, I really do try to make it very easily. I mean, especially me being a guy, I mean, I do try to be reading the body language and the social cues is really big. I try to keep a lot of distance, you know, all that. So, you know, after getting the statement or corroborating what they're saying versus what we, you know, what I have as a statement, then we move towards the symptoms, which is things like anxiety and maybe suspiciousness, like looking out your window. And it could be a lot of ritualistic type of behaviors, checking locks and windows over and over again. Detachment from people, always a big one with this, is the detachment to humanity is another big symptom. And you know, when I spend time with somebody after a good, you know, even 20, 30, 40 minutes, I can bring out the personality. There's a person in there. There will be laughter. There might be crying, but you could see that this person has gone through the roller coaster of this to get to where we are right now. You know, to even be able to go down the road of talking about it, it usually is a significant other or a family member or even another veteran that's like, you got to do this, you know. So once we get near the end, that's when I try to start breaking the stuff down in terms of this is why this is happening. Or this is why you're getting so mad when your son leaves out a cup in the sink. You know, this is what that's about. People leave, they get a take home from it. It's like a nugget of knowledge about this stuff. It's like, I wish somebody would have told me this 25 years ago. I might have saved me, you know. So even though we're doing the evaluation, I'm getting all the data I can from them. I'm talking to them about the records, like, oh, looks like you were in Fort Hood, Texas in 1990. Oh, yeah, I was there. You know, and so that's how we kind of go through the evidence. Some of the files are so big, I just do it on my own because I don't want to have them sit there while I go through all their records. But a lot of times I have a few things that I want to ask them about or just go through it. But then at the end, like I say, I do like to go through this stuff. I give them my card, you know, if you ever have any questions. Because sometimes in the moment, people forget, you know, it's like, oh gosh, I meant to tell them this, you know. Because that's another big thing with this is the memory loss. When the anxiety's high, it's hard to learn anything new. It's hard to listen and just take in any piece of information. So a lot of folks are missing stuff. So it's like, you know, feel free to reach out. And then I try to segue it to about once it's service connected, they'll always be able to go to the VA for treatment, but they could use the Veterans Choice, go outside the VA. And then, of course, you know, you could use the benefits towards insurance or private practice. And I tell them with mental health, it's different strokes for different folks. So what works for some people is really going to turn others off. And so that's kind of how I end it that way. So it's supposed to be an information gathering session and not a therapy session, but you can't just leave people hanging. You got to make people feel good. The way this really should be done is when people are coming in, I mean, you need to make them feel very welcome. Can I get you a cup of coffee? I mean, because the anxiety of just driving over, I mean, just the week before, like, I don't even know this guy. What's he going to be asking me? You know, so I really try to lower that down, you know. I mean, this doesn't have to be a root canal, you know. So, but yeah, that's in a nutshell kind of how I do the MST exam.
I think it's important to note that you said that you don't straight out ask them, so what happened? You look in the record, and if you don't have to ask specifically to have them retell the story, that's really important, because I have a lot of veterans who don't want to go because they don't want to talk about it anymore. They don't want to keep saying the same thing and reliving those traumas. But I mean, that's very case specific towards what examiner you're getting. But I would think overall, it's going to be more of an information gathering of your current symptoms and your life and things like that. And if you've given enough information in the stressor statement, you're most likely not going to have to retell it, the story of what happened. But I mean,
it doesn't have to be word for word kind of a thing. You know, and you'd be surprised that by not pressuring people, you get a lot more information when people are comfortable. So yeah, an open-ended question like, so what happened? You know, I mean, you'd think you would get more data, but you know, first people start to think it's like, well, where do I even begin? Well, it all started, right when I first got there. Okay. I was being harassed since day one. You know what I mean? It's like, you know, I, I hate to have people go through all that. Like, I can see, through the statements, because a lot of times the statements are extremely specific. Now, if it's very vague and it just said sexual assault, Texas, or something like that, okay, well, that might need, we're going to have to go into some detail on that. But a lot of times, I mean, I get chunks of paragraphs with explicit detail that it's like, okay, this works for me. Not every provider is like that. So I do want to put that out there too, is, some providers won't even allow significant others or family members to come back in the exams, where anybody who wants to come and learn about this stuff, come on back. That's another thing that I do that a lot of providers won't do, because I've had a lot of people say, the last person wouldn't let me come back. I'm like, well, it's their office. They can do what they want. So
it's important to provide a detailed statement of the occurrence. So if you go to a C&P examiner, they can read that prior to, if they're reviewing your file, and it's less likely that you have to actually keep retelling the story over and over.
Less likely, but I got to tell you, sometimes I feel like people, because I'll read past ones that were done, and it just has this feeling like maybe the provider was trying to assume they were lying about it. I mean, it's as insane as that sounds. I mean, you wouldn't think that somebody would be made to believe that they just came here today to waste your time. But there's a lot of providers that do that. And so that hurts this more, because it further creates that distrust.
So how many veterans have come to you and you've thought that they were lying or making up the story?
I never thought anyone was lying, especially about the sexual trauma stuff. Anything, I mean, some of the weakest claims I've ever heard were like, she broke up with me and, we were supposed to get married. And it's like, okay, well, that does sound terrible, but that is not a claim for post-traumatic stress, but I've never thought, sitting across from somebody, that they were being untruthful. Never.
And that's really important to note, is that this isn't something people are going to lie about. Is there a very, very small chance? Absolutely. But the majority of people who are claiming this, first of all, it's hard for them to even claim this. I mean, who wants to claim that they were sexually assaulted? But the decisions that come back from the VA are extremely negative. And like you said, there are providers who coming into it thinking that they're lying and making it up, but that's just one provider. That doesn't mean give up on your claim. I think if there's evidence there are ways to prove it. And it's just so many of these cases either aren't claimed at all or given up on because they don't think anyone's going to believe them.
I've taken a look at that, and I think the reason that it could be perceived that there's lying is that I don't think people understand how prevalent this stuff really is. I mean, I talk about this matter of fact as when I see a female veteran, I almost expect it. If your claim is not MST, at some point, I'm still going to ask you, like, so, I mean, at some point, somebody said something to you sexually or tried something. And some of them will be like, oh, yeah, but that's not why I'm here. It's like even though, it is extremely prevalent. And I think if as much as went down was really reported, it would blow people's minds, because people really, I think, want to believe that it's not that bad out there, and that's not true. Like I say, I'm doing at least one a day. So that's 5 a week. That's 20 a month. That's what, 240 a year. I mean, I've done this for like 8 to 10 years. That's like almost 2,000. I mean, that's just me.
And those are ones that are actually claimed. There's so many that they don't even claim them. And I think it's, you say a woman comes in and you expect and you look for MST, but I think people don't realize how prevalent it is in men too. And that's because of underreporting and, societal pressures of the taboo and experiencing sexual assault. So I feel like if a man is coming forward and saying he was sexually assaulted, probably happened. No one's going to say that happened to them and it didn't. I mean, of course, are there situations? Absolutely. But I'm just saying, as a person who sees this every day, if someone's claiming it, it most likely happened.
With the males, a lot of times it's groups. It's like 3 or 4 on one kind of a deal, because it definitely with males is extremely prevalent as well.
So after you do the examination, you have all your information, and now you're coming up with your opinion of whether what happened is caused their current PTSD or mental health condition. What's your process for that? And how do you decide whether it's service connected or not?
One, I do get those markers, and I get 4 or 5 or 6 of them to really demonstrate to the VA that part of it. And then with the symptoms that, if I have a 45-year-old lady who's never been married, never had any kids, there's all different types of scenarios. But when you have this picture you can paint, and then you have these symptoms to go along with it and these markers, then I can say it is at least as likely as not. I mean, we at least have a coin flip of this 50-50 that this happened. I mean, it's not like the VA is just sitting here trying to deny stuff. They just want real evidence, and that's fair. So when they have it, I mean, I usually with these cases, usually it does end up being post-traumatic stress with maybe panic disorder and or major depression. Yeah, I mean, the VA, I do feel like when they have the evidence and you can corroborate the evidence with what you're seeing in front of you, yeah, I mean, you can say it's at least as likely as not that happened. A lot of times when I give people my card, I get people right back. I had a lady send me a letter or send me a thank you note, and it said, thank you for being patient and listening to me. It's been 33 years, and I never talked about this. And I mean, obviously I love doing this and helping the veterans, but it also shows that the VA is listening. And if you are able to support these claims with evidence, they'll connect it to service.
I mean, I have to disagree. I think the VA does just deny things. Not that they're just denying it. Like you said, it's the lack of evidence, but the examiners don't dive into the evidence like you do. I think you are an outlier and you really care about this, and this is your sole practice of what you do. So you're really digging in deep and looking for those markers. So for someone who doesn't have an examiner like you and is denied, I think it's important to not give up and have someone, I mean, obviously I would say an attorney or a veteran service officer go through and look for those potential markers, because just because you were denied that first time, that doesn't mean they went thoroughly through your file. I mean,
right. And
there could be one marker that they didn't even see. There could be multiple markers that they didn't see or even try to gather the evidence. I think you are a very special examiner and you really care, and you're going to do whatever you can to get them connected.
For sure. I mean, I'm going to go through it. I mean, I do see reports where I'll ask the claimant straight up, like, how much time did this provider spend with you? And sometimes they'll be like, it was like, I don't know, 15 minutes, and it's like, yeah, they wouldn't even look at me. Yeah. Guy was looking down the computer the whole time, just asked me if I wanted to hurt myself or anybody else. Like, okay, sounds like we have enough. And it's like, wait, what? Yeah. I mean, veterans can get copies of their claims from the VA. I mean, it's not an easy process, but nor is anything else. But you can do it. It is good to just see what the providers are saying. Because if you got denied, it's not necessarily because of the VA. The VA's looking at the report, and if they get something that says, sounds like she's doing okay. The impairment was low. She's working at Lowe's and promoted into, part-time manager. I guess she's all right. It is a lot what they're getting to. But sure, I mean, they're going to do their due diligence and look for reasons why this might not be service connected, or ask more questions. This type of claim, I get more addendums and clarifications than any other type of claim, because a lot of times when I have the markers, they want to know, like, well, where's the divorce papers, or where's the arrest affidavit, and it's Come on, I mean, so the markers are challenging to prove. I mean, when I can get service treatment records like this person, a lot of times they're not going to go sexual trauma and PTSD when you were, a Walter Reed or something like that. They're going to go under the umbrella of adjustment disorder and anxiety. It's going to be a much smaller, but even if there's that, at least we can say, well, here's a person that didn't have mental health problems. And now all of a sudden here in 85, they went to a clinic because of heart palpitations. Like, okay, now we got something here, so, but then no, that stuff's not easy to find. That I can assure you. A lot of times it is difficult.
And mentioning of getting copies of the exams, I mean, you can it's the Freedom of Information Act. You can request that you get a copy of your claims file, which will include your C&P exams. And I think that's extremely important for veterans to be able to see what happened. I mean, it's a medical record. You should have access to that, and you do have access to that. A couple follow-ups for when you're making the decision. You mentioned abuse prior to service. How does that play into it? Because I have seen denials where they will say there was abuse prior to, or potentially stressors after, like family, marital, life stressors after that are causing their current mental health condition rather than the stressor in service. How does that play into your decision?
It's much more difficult when somebody has abuse prior to. Now this is work. I mean, because now it becomes very difficult to prove to the VA how this now is it. Why wasn't it issued then? Here's how we have to go with that one. The entrance and separation examination are huge with that one, because if we can show that this person, had some issues when they were 7, okay, but that uncle died now, and this is a person that got well adjusted after that, never had any problems. Now here we are 15 years later, and this is a person that was getting promoted quickly, things like that we can show the time period. We can show that like, oh, made E5 in like a year, stuff like that. But
that entrance exam is extremely important, because we have to remember that veterans have a presumption of soundness. If that abuse or anything isn't mentioned as a defect or mentioned on that entrance examination, then they are presumed sound. And it's it's the VA's burden to prove, no, their current mental health condition is due to that childhood trauma rather than the military sexual trauma in service.
That's right. That entrance exam really is, especially if we can find now some service treatment records or other markers like we were talking about after that healthy entrance exam, just as it is in Hill and Ponton's world as well, is the more evidence, it does make it easier.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, those statements are huge. Those change of behavior, even if you didn't tell anybody at the time, I mean, there's the scenario or surrounding it makes sense of why you didn't tell someone in a lot of the cases. And so those behavior changes, substance abuse, all of those are very important factors. And the only way you're going to know is if it's in your claims file. You got to get a copy of it. And I would have a professional look at it. But my thing is, these are very near and dear to me, because it's so hard to tell someone that this happened to you. And experiencing something like this can have an effect on the rest of your life. And it's similar to combat, but in a different situation. I mean, PTSD isn't something that gets better. It's something that you just learn to live with in most situations. So don't give up on your claim. I mean, have a professional look at it, whomever it is, because majority of the time, they're going to deny it the first time. They're going to deny it the second time. You really need someone to look through the evidence and see if those markers are there, or just talk to you about what you experienced, because you're not always going to have a good C&P examiner like Dr. Vonetes. I mean, most of the time you're not going to. And the ones who do have him and the other ones who are dedicated to helping veterans, that they're very lucky. But for me, I say, don't give up. We will believe you, and we will help you with your cases. And do you have any specific MST advice for veterans who are struggling, whether even to make a claim or going through the process of a claim?
Yes. I mean, The not talking about it when it happened is completely understandable. Yeah, I had a counselor one time. I was doing a continuing education, and one of the cognitive distortions was should and must statements. Don't should on yourself. Don't say I should have done this, I should do that. Don't put that much pressure on yourself. Now is the time that if you're in a place where you do feel like talking about it, then only you know when it is right. But the one thing I will say, the best advice I can give you is gather up as much data as you possibly can to show how things changed or what things have occurred due to this that have caused significant social or occupational impairment in your life.
The human mind is incredible. I mean, a lot of people repress what happens for years, and then something triggers and all of it comes flooding back. I mean, whether it happened last year, 10 years, 30 years ago, you can always make a claim for benefits. The most important part is getting that evidence to show that, your current mental health condition is related to that. But I mean, that's all I have. I think it's important the most important factors that we really talked about were this is way more prevalent than people think for women and men. It's happening every day. It's unreported majority of the time, but that doesn't mean it's not happening. And it's something that can affect you for the rest of your life. And I think that if you are comfortable with making a claim for benefits and having a professional look at it, absolutely do it. Don't give up on your claim. Don't give up on your story. And hopefully you'll get a good C&P examiner like Dr. Vonetes to help you through this process. Thank you to everyone who served, everyone who's watching. If you found this video helpful, let us know in the comments and make sure you leave a like and subscribe, and don't miss our next video because we'll be doing some more and talking about things that specifically Dr. Vonetes can give us his personal and professional perspective on. So Dr. Vonetes, where can people find you?
You can find our practice at Voncare, VON Care, and you can find me and my podcast at Doc V for Vets. That's Doc V, the number 4. Vets. And yes, I want to thank everybody for listening today. I know this is a really tough and sensitive topic, but I do feel like we helped folks today to understand about how prevalent this really is and to feel good about putting a claim together if you haven't already.
Absolutely. And we will continue this series. And if there are specific topics that people would like us to talk about, let us know in the comments. Thank you all for watching and have a wonderful day.
Take care.